Following on from last week's parable of the sower, or the soils, I want to read a parable entitled A Parable of the Weeds. Matthew 13, 24 through 30. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat among them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds, and then in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." You know, once again, here is a common everyday experience in the farming life of ancient Israel and Palestine. There was a prolific weed at the time called the bearded darnel. Now, it's important to know about this particular weed because when it's growing, it's impossible to distinguish it from wheat. You get it? Something very, very similar. The roots become entwined and the darnel cannot be uprooted without ruining the wheat. That's the whole point of this particular parable. So you have to be aware that that's the problem. So at harvest time, they have to be able to distinguish between the two. Now, the idea of enemies, opposition farmers, was very real. Roman laws even addressed it because people did this kind of thing. We have all kinds of tricks that people get up to in business and commerce and life today. But in the farming world, they try to mess up each other's harvest in this kind of way. Later in the chapter, in verses 36 through 43, we have an explanation of the parable. It points to the fact that the kingdom, which will one day extend throughout the whole world, is a context where good and bad live alongside each other. There is a time to change our minds. There is a time to alter our minds. We must be alert to the challenge of the weeds. It has a powerful message for us. And we must encourage growth, but with an eye to the fact that weeds will need to be attended to in our lives. You can't just say to yourself, "I'm going to leave everything." When the harvest comes, if we're not really attending to things at that point, then the very good things that we might call the seed and the wheat gets ruined. So it is in our lives. Very often, it's hard to distinguish between good and bad. It's hard to distinguish between the things that affect our lives and come into our life situation. But we have to be aware of it and the dangers that truly come if we don't deal with it at the very end, at the harvest time. I wonder if you think about that, if there are things that you've seen that you didn't attend to, and you say, "Gosh, I wish I had. I wish at the harvest time I'd got myself together." Bearded darnel. It's got a great message for us today. It speaks into our situation. So when it talks about the parable of the weeds, I think it's a little different than when I first read this years ago. When I start to understand, it has an application to the very real situations of life in the world today. And so it is that many people just think they can get rid of the things they think are bad and deal with it at the first situation. No, there's a right time to deal with it. Because if you deal with it at the wrong time, you might even ruin the things that will be a wonderful harvest, if only let be. So when that time comes, we've got to really attend to what is there. So Jesus, after telling a parable about soil and about seeds, now warns us of other things that are a danger in our lives, a danger that we must be careful to attend to if we're going to really see the fruit of God's Spirit in our lives. Are you prepared to do that? Are you prepared to try to look at things as they are and distinguish between what's good and what's bad? You may not have the time to do it unless you do it at the right time. There may not be time later. So in a garden, we have a lesson this time, not just of good things that grow and produce a mighty harvest, but of those things that can spoil the harvest in our lives.